Okay, good morning. Just about good morning again. Because we are dealing with the digital brochure, usually there is a piece of paper in front of you with the Wi-Fi password. So some of you have asked, so I'll just give it to you now. So if you wanted to use the Wi-Fi instead of the data on your phones, you go to Hyatt Meeting. Yes. And the Wi-Fi password or passcode will be 922590. So Hyatt Meeting, the passcode is 922590. All right? Save yourself some money. Okay, can I ask everyone who's maybe outside of the exhibition area, who might be milling around near the doorways, to please have their seats so we can commence the first of the afternoon sessions. And one small apology for this morning's session. I understand the minister had to go to a funeral. So that's why we didn't have questions from the floor. I will correct that this afternoon, and there will be questions from the floor for our panelists. All right? This morning, we spoke about artificial intelligence, big data, and the future of a smart society. That was the first panel that we had. And now, we want to explore some of big data and AI's transformational roles. Yes? What are the prospects for the use of big data and artificial intelligence in Trinidad and Tobago in order to advance sustainable development here? I always tell everyone whenever I speak at one of these things, I will kill 30 more seconds for people who are outside to keep walking in, that my vision for Trinidad and Tobago is a Trinidad and Tobago that's the best country in the world to live and to do business. Yeah? If we can do that here, it's the best place to raise a family, to live, have a quality of life, and the best place in order to pursue business ventures. That, in essence, is what sustainable development is about. And therefore, what is the role of big data analytics and artificial intelligence in getting us from where we are now, right, to that envisioned better Trinidad and Tobago? Yes? And to do that this afternoon, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Raymond Prasad, the economist in the Resident Coordinator's Office in Port of Spain, who will moderate today's session. Mr. Prasad's panel will comprise Kishan Kumar Singh, the head of the Multilateral Environmental Agreements Unit in the Ministry of Planning and Development. I think most of us here know Kishan's face. Yeah. Abdullahi Abdul Kadri from ECLAC, the Social Affairs Officer. Regina Baktieva, the Program Officer, the Program Policy Officer of the World Food Program, and a great source of chocolates, right? Your secret is out, Regina, right? Besham Ramlal, Dr. Besham Ramlal, a professor of geospatial engineering at the University of the West Indies. And Ruana Haynes, the senior legal advisor for climate analytics. I will ask the panelists and the moderator to take the stage and for this afternoon session to begin. And a reminder, there will be questions from the floor for this panel.
Sorry. Thank you. As Mark mentioned, my name is Raymond Prasad, and I'm the economist. And we have our eminent panel today. Kishan, I think, as Mark mentioned, there is no need to introduce him, but you know, Kishan is not only known well in Trinidad, he's known internationally. So when I was walking in the Pacific, and the only name you hear from the Caribbean in negotiating climate deals was Kishan. So a lot of people know him across the world. And as the head of the Multilateral Agency for Climate Change, he has been doing a fantastic work and has been part of a number of expert committees on technology transfer and subsidiary board of the Scientific and Technical Advice and the co-chair of the Paris Agreement Implementation Committee. The other member we have is Dr. Bhisham Ramlal, a very eminent professor from UWI, who had done his PhD from the US with masters in integrated map and geoinformation production in Netherlands, and also holds a Bachelor of Science on land surveying from UWI. The other colleague is Rowena Haynes, a senior legal advisor, as well as the director of climate analytics for the Caribbean office. And she is the lead senior legal advisor at Climate Analytics, and also, as I mentioned, the director. So she has a significant amount of experience in this area from a legal fraternity. My colleague, Regina Bakteva, is the head of the WFP Satellite Office for Trinidad and Tobago. And prior to this, she actually had significant experience working for WFP in Yemen and in Sudan, responding to humanitarian and emergency issues, as well as she also worked for the Australian Embassy and holds a master's degree in international relations from Moscow State Institute. And my colleague to the far left, Abdul, he's a social affairs officer and also the coordinator of the Statistics and Social Development Unit of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And he has done significant amount of work across the region on setting up technical assistance to the Caribbean countries, and also on the 2030 agenda and the data related to the SDGs. Abdul was, in his former life, a professor of applied economics, and I didn't know until I talked to him that he also studied in Australia. We were at the same time, but in different universities. So welcome. And let me just invite Kishan to deliver with a keynote address, and then we'll go into a panel discussion, following which we will open the floor for discussion with the audience. Kishan, please.
Do I use this mic or this mic?
No.
This away. Thank you very much, Raymond, and good afternoon. First off, let me thank the organizers for the opportunity to share some thoughts on what the title says, of course, big data analytics and its role in climate change and natural disasters. My forte is in climate change, but it is not separate from any other natural disaster related issue, including volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and the like, because they all affect human well-being in the long run. So my talk would be focused on how big data analytics can serve and has served, in fact, climate change. But before I get into that, maybe it might be instructive to talk a little bit about the science of climate change and what it entails, so that it provides the context for which big data analytics can now be applied. So in the climate science involves basically every facet of traditional science and the natural sciences as we know it. So it's about the interaction between the atmosphere, between the cryosphere, I'm speaking globally, which is the ice-covered areas of the globe, the lithosphere or the crust, the hydrosphere or the water cycle, the oceans, and the biosphere, which includes the forests and everything that is living on Earth. And also involves the the physics and the chemistry for the natural scientists among us, an understanding of the physics of the atmosphere and every other aspect of the global ecosystem. It involves an understanding of the chemistry of all of these, as well as the biology, and how these interact. And how these interact actually gives rise to the climate as we know it, the global climate, and how that global climate is distributed in regions, including for us here in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Caribbean region. And climate is what determines where humans and how humans live. That is why we have very large populations in the tropics and very sparse populations in the poles, because life in the tropics, we all know, is livable in a very comfortable way. And therefore, how changes in all of these parts of the living whole can be had also affects life in all its facets. So when we talk about climate change, when we talk about climate, we talk about the average of the temperature, precipitation over a 30-year period. And the climate is basically determined by the average temperature that is spread over a period of time. And that temperature is also determined by the sunlight that comes in and heats up the earth, and the amount of heat that is re-radiated back into the atmosphere that keeps the earth at that equilibrated balance. Over time, we know man has developed machines and so on, and to drive those machines from the Industrial Revolution, he needed energy, and energy was available in the form of fossil fuels. And so he began to burn fossil fuels. And when you burn fossil fuels, you have a few things that happen. You get as byproducts carbon dioxide, you get nitrous oxide, you get, I'm sorry for being technical, but I'm sure you understand what I'm saying. And these gases are termed as greenhouse gases, which are not bad in themselves, because without them, life would be impossible in the world, because it is the greenhouse gases themselves that maintain the temperature that allows life to exist. But when you have more greenhouse gases going up in the atmosphere as a result of man activities, you get a change in the atmospheric parameters, in the temperature, and that transforms changes in precipitation, for example, or rainfall, and these have knock-on effects. So understanding the changes and the causes and impacts is critically important in the light and in the face of climate change and human-induced climate change at that. So what are some of the impacts? When we have increased temperature, we have increased evapotranspiration, meaning you have more water going up. And the higher the temperature, the more water that goes up, the more will come down. And that more will come down in less time. So we are seeing, for example, in Trinidad and the region, in many parts of the world, we are now hearing of unprecedented floods. We're also hearing about droughts. We've seen in Trinidad here and in the region unprecedented heat waves over the past 2 months, for example. It causes a rise in the sea level because of expansion of seawater, as well as the melting of ice caps, which is fresh water, and that changes the salt content of the oceans, and then the ocean circulation changes. And when the ocean circulation changes, the heat in the ocean becomes redistributed, and then you have more heat being absorbed, for example, because of more of increased temperatures, and then that feeds hurricanes, and then hurricanes increase in intensity and frequency. And for us in the Caribbean region, we all know only too well what those impacts are, because we're in the line of the hurricane belt. So we are directly in the paths of those hurricanes and storms. It causes as well changes in the biodiversity. And for us who understand biodiversity at a very granular level, it's something that we take for granted. For those of you who had lunch today, you would have eaten biodiversity. And you will eat biodiversity later for dinner, as you will tomorrow morning for breakfast. And so climate change will affect biodiversity. It will affect agricultural production because of the changes in soil aridity, for example. In the oceans, the increased carbon dioxide will cause increased acidity of the oceans, and that will change the coral reef structure, for example, things that we take for granted in the Caribbean. And that will have knock-on effects. So with each, you have a domino effect. If you have impacts on coral reefs, you have impacts on the ecosystems and the fisheries that they maintain and supply for food. You have less protection for the coast because coral reefs act as wave breakers and wave energy. So if that is gone, then when you couple that with increased storm surges arising from hurricanes, you have more inundation, more land inundation from the sea. And because we are small island states, you have flooded coastal zones. Everything in a small island takes place on the coastal zone. Transportation links, coastal communities, business and industry as we have them here in Trinidad. And therefore the impacts on the socioeconomic well-being of a nation, and nations are therefore impacted. So therefore we understand that climate change will have these impacts, and there's a knock-on effect. But how do you begin to deal with it? How do you begin to understand what these are? So in order to really pull all of that together and in a sensible way, we do what is called vulnerability analyses. But because climate change impacts are different in different parts of the world, we see, for example, that impacts on small island states might be particularly severe compared to a large continent. How then do you respond to those impacts? And the impacts are not only in the biophysical environment, but it's also on human systems, socioeconomics, economic growth, for example. It impacts on all of these aspects of human well-being. So what has been done, and this is where big data analytics come in. You have all of this, you have to understand all of the chemistry, all of the physics, all of the biology goes into modeling what climate change impacts can be in terms of the vulnerability assessments. So it goes into computer and predictive modeling and projected modeling. So you get a sense of what those impacts are going to be, not only on the biophysical environment, but also on the socioeconomic environment. Because you also have to know what are the intervention options that you can put in place for a particular set of impacts. And it's not only about the intervention options, but what are the technological applications that could accompany the intervention options that will mitigate against or adapt to or cope with those impacts. What will the cost be? What will the cost-benefit analysis be? How do you make the choice? How would that affect the country's economy or the region's economy? Because when you impact on resources, you impact on economies, especially human resources. All of these things is where the big data analytics come in, because it not only does the analysis for you, it also answers some of the questions, because what it does, it brings to the fore the hidden information in all of that data, because then you begin to see what the trends have been, what the backcasting has been, and what the forecasting can be, and match up. And therefore, you can learn from experience and then apply that to what you expect and project in the future. So this basically allows not only businesses to make smart business decisions in terms of market analysis and so on, but from a climate change perspective, it also informs policymakers on what are the best policy decisions to take. And it's not easy, I would imagine, as a politician, although I'm not one. I could just imagine how difficult it might be to make smart decisions, informed decisions, especially if those decisions will impact on human lives, and more importantly, the electorate, which could perhaps, complicate how effective a particular set of solutions could be. But it not only does that, it also helps answers questions. The analytics also helps answers questions. So for example, what would be the likely impact on water resources from a, let's say, a 1 degree rise, a 1 degree Celsius rise in the temperature? And how would that impact affect human health in terms of the availability of potable water, in terms of the availability of water for sanitation, in terms of the availability of water for irrigation, and the knock-on effect of how would irrigation deficit now impact on food production and food security, and how would that come back again and impact on human health, because on human health and nutrition. So all of these things are linked. Or what would be the implications for the communities on the coast as a small island developing state if we have a 5 centimeter rise in sea level, for example? Or what would be the optimum or the optimal intervention options that we can implement to reduce or to absorb these impacts or to mitigate against these impacts? Or what would be the cost to taxpayers of such interventions that policymakers would have to take into consideration? So big data analytics is not only also applicable to projecting climate change or assessing vulnerability or informing intervention options, but it also is important in short-term climate risks. When every night you look at the weather report on whatever station you like, and you say, well, in the next 5 days, we're going to have rain with some sun, and look out for flash flooding here, and so on and so forth. That is a result of big data analytics, because it has a critical role to play in forecasting. So short-term weather patterns are also critically important. It also helps to inform flood preparedness and evacuation plans. We have seen in Port of Spain, and I suppose in many other areas, where sudden downpours can cause flash flooding with little or no warning. And to fully prepare for that, this is where big data analytics, as well as artificial intelligence, that forms part of big data analytics that can inform response measures, for example, comes in. The role of artificial intelligence in addressing climate change has been an increasingly interesting one, and one that has been evolving over the years. So in some areas, for example, artificial intelligence is being used to tell you exactly what type of crops you can plant at what time of the year to get the maximum yield, given a certain set of weather conditions that we can expect. And that is, of course, beyond human capacity to analyze, because the more data you put into AI, the more accurate it becomes. And so we see intervention options for adaptation, for coping mechanisms to the impacts of climate change are increasingly being informed by artificial intelligence. And so AI, and I'm sticking to AI because this is where the biggest sort of impact on climate response can be had. It can revolutionize the approach to carbon neutrality, which is what also the Paris Agreement aspires the world to achieve in the second half of this century, and usher in an era of intelligent sustainability on a global and regional scale. At a time, of course, when the race is on to keep Earth from heating to dangerous levels. And what is dangerous levels? Again, that is informed by big data analytics. So I spoke about coral reefs, and the science and the analysis tells us that at 1 degree warming, we can expect between 70 to 90% of coral reefs to disappear. The world is at 1.15 degree warming as we stand. At 2 degrees warming, or at 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, we can expect between 90 to 99% of all coral reefs to be decimated. That means the ecosystems that they support, the fisheries they support, it would be gone. But coral reefs also are a potent source of pharmaceuticals. And so therefore we will lose a potent source of pharmaceuticals that will treat diseases, and diseases that we don't know of, or that will come, or that will be increased and exacerbated by warmer temperatures and climate change, and therefore we'll have a less resource pool from which we can take chemicals to treat diseases. So it's all linked at the same time. So what we are saying is that AI is being critically used as a catalyst in big data analysis, for calculations, for forecasts, for predictions of natural disasters, both in the near future and in the long term, for the establishment of the possibilities to escape the hazards of risky situations. I spoke of flood-prone areas and flash flooding and so on, as well as to prepare the human being, the individual, as we stand here, for adverse changes, including changes associated with climate change and any other change that may come as a result of natural disasters, and drawing on the different choices as assisting the right decision to be made and to be, more importantly, accepted. So the role of big data analytics goes beyond the computer, goes beyond the science, goes beyond the technicalities that we often associate these things to be, but actually impacts on decisions that can affect each and every one of us. So that's my short talk. I could continue for a long time, but I won't. And just to say thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Kishan. I think Kishan did really well in terms of looking at the variability and touching on some of the key issues on rainfall variability as well, which is also affecting Trinidad, carbon neutrality, the role of AI and sustainability, and the relative risk. How do you look at loss and damage? And that's something that probably would be the key discussion at the COP meeting this year, which will start probably next week, and will go into early December. So without further ado, let me start off with our panel. And before going on to the individual questions, let me start off with the first generic question to all the panel members. And maybe I start with Ruana in terms of how the big data has helped in tracking climate change and disaster risk reduction, and what are the challenges that you still see in this space? Please, go ahead.
I take it I can speak from here, yes. Everyone can hear me. Thank you so much, and thank you to Kishan for that excellent opening. I think he covered everything in the most expansive way possible, so I feel very confident now that I can keep my remarks quite brief. Based on what Kishan has said, it's very clear the role that big data plays in the context of climate change writ large and in the efforts to address climate change. One of the key areas that it serves, we term as climate services from a climate science perspective. And this deals with everything from the modeling that Kishan spoke to, economic modeling for various sectoral transitions, as well as the modeling trying to predict and understand impacts, and modeling that goes into resilience building and influences policymaking for disaster risk reduction on the whole. So there is a very key role for data and AI to play and to continue to play in this area. I will say from a small island developing state perspective, there's much more that needs to be done to promote this. There's much more that needs to be done in terms of putting policy frameworks in place to advance ourselves in this area, including in the area of legislation to address a number of the challenges that exist. For example, we know in our context, a lot of the data that we need to inform these very large models is fragmented. So some data will be with the Met agency or office, some data might be with a planning ministry, some data might be elsewhere, a Ministry of Health, a Ministry of Agriculture, because as Kishan explained, when we assess climate change and we want to understand climate impacts and our response, it is a whole of economy type of consideration. So one of the main issues we need to still deal with in our context is how do we get that data centralized? How do we ensure that it is being considered in one central area towards the objective of climate planning, towards the objective of ensuring that our response to the impacts that we are already experiencing is commensurate. So I would say that's one of the key areas where more work needs to be done, and I'll probably leave it there until you come back. Thanks.
Thank you for your intervention. I would like to bring in Dr. Bisham Ramlal here and talking about more in the geospatial space of information. And Ruana mentioned about the centrality of data and interdependence between data, putting them together. What's your view on that related to this question on the challenges?
Thank you for the question. There's a saying that goes, everything that happens somewhere. Knowing what is happening, where, and why is very important for us for decision making, for resource allocation, for understanding the threats, understanding the particular trends that are there, so we can support decisions. So, for example, we can't always use hard engineering solutions to fix particular challenges. We may have to decide that it's too expensive, and we actually have to move people and move communities, for example. Those kinds of hard decisions must be made using the best available information we have to us, available to us. And so that's the thing. But in the Caribbean region, there are a lot of challenges. What we find is that a lot of times, and I think you said it, people are not playing together. In fact, even within countries, I have found in the region where agencies want to sign MOUs with other government agencies to share data. And when, in fact, in my opinion, it's all public data procured by public funds, and therefore it really belongs to everyone to be used. So there is a lack of collaboration. I've found that across many of the Caribbean region. The other thing, though, there's a lack of resources, human and other resources. And one of the challenges we have with the region is that when we train up people, we invest a lot of money, a lot of resources in educating our people. They're quickly picked up by one of the developed countries, that we lose a lot of our investments, and therefore we are stuck, and we are spread very thin in many of our regions to have expertise to support what we are doing. And the other thing is we don't have the necessary infrastructure, such as computing infrastructure and other things like that, to support the analytical work that we need to do. And therefore, if we treat with this as individual countries with the kind of diversity we have in the region, we are not likely to get anywhere anytime soon. And so we have to think in terms of how we collaborate, and perhaps how we use what I call intermediaries, people with expertise that we can share those kinds of good practices across the region. So I'll stop there with my comment.
Thank you, Dr. Ramlal. I mean, you raised some of the key issues related to the analytical work, expertise, lack of capacity, and also the challenges of public data, and that's where I can bring in Abdul. He has worked across the region in terms of building data capacity. Abdul, if you want to share your thoughts on this.
Yes, thank you very much, Raymond. And it looks like my colleagues on the panel have said a lot, and the kind of things that ordinarily will highlight, they have already highlighted. But I would like to touch on one area which maybe when we're having a discussion like this may not rise to the level of the importance that it should. It came up a little bit in the earlier panel where Minister Beku spoke to the issue of privacy, and I think Mr. Rajaram also alluded to that. Minister Beku described the issue of privacy in terms of, and the use of big data and analytics, where we have to highlight fairness, transparency, and honesty. And I would like to add to that the ethical use of data, where we can, privacy as well as consider the issue of trust. We saw that during COVID-19, where there was a lot of vaccine hesitancy because of the lack of trust in the vaccine or what may be done with their data and things like that. So when we have an environment or a society in which there is not much known about big data or artificial intelligence, then there has to be, we need to address the possible resistance to the use of big data or artificial intelligence, which will be more critical at the level of data collection, where you gather data. Minister Beku make an example of the old lady who couldn't, use the ATM. So we have people who have, smart cell phone, they go on Facebook, they go on social media, they generate a lot of information. They may not know that their data is being used. But when there is not a conscious effort to actually harvest this data, And then you now engage in discussion with people maybe who live in low-lying areas, sea level rise, and then they are at the risk of inundation from flooding. Let me use an example where I can bring this a little bit closer home. I have a little bit of knowledge about statistics, and I'm aware about big data and artificial intelligence. And I know the use of cookies on machines. One thing that I wasn't quite conscious of is I'm a frequent flyer because of the nature of our job, and I do have the app of an airline. So I believe when I go online, maybe to purchase a ticket, because I'm using the app, I'm a frequent flyer, I will get a benefit of that. So I'm never concerned about how, when I log on, how my data will be used, or maybe there's a cookie that is monitoring me. So I mentioned to a colleague in the office that, I bought a ticket, and it's so expensive. I don't know why, things are getting expensive. And she said, did you search? Did you buy this incognito? I said, no, I don't need to, because he said, you sure? And I was thinking about that. Why do I need to do that? So I'm a registered frequent flyer. So I was thinking about this for 2 days. So eventually I went incognito to search for the same flight that I already bought. Luckily, again, because I have a membership of that airline, I could hold the ticket for a few hours or days before I purchase it. And I discovered that the flight that I already bought, initially I searched for the flight, I got a price. When I went to book it, the price went up, so I quickly bought it. When I went back and searched incognito, I got the earlier price, which was $150 cheaper. So I canceled my flight, bought it incognito, and then, so with that kind of ethical consideration where you feel like, well, I trusted these people, they should know me, but this is what happened to me. I'm supposed to be the one that they give preference to. But what they are doing is that they are taking advantage of my trust. And that's the kind of thing that we have to be aware of. For example, when hurricane warning is given in Florida, for example, there are people who will say, well, we are going to ride out this storm. And that's the kind of a challenge that we should anticipate and know how we deal with that, with better information to the public.
Thank you, Abdul, for that expressive example in terms of how the big data is harvested and who's using. And if anyone would like to get more details on this, the UN Secretary General's special report on data that is also published on the UN website, which talks about how the data is harvested from developing countries, but used and actually capitalized in value terms in developed countries. So there is about a 50-page report. I think if you want to just read the executive summary, that's available online for your information. And I would like to bring in Regina and then Kishan on this. Regina, how would you see the big data challenges and tracking climate change and disaster risks in a humanitarian perspective, given your work? And what do you think are the challenges from a WFP perspective?
Thank you, Raymond. But first of all, I would like to make a reference to the title of this panel coming from the UN, natural disasters. There is no such thing as natural disasters, because disasters are not natural. It's our human activity or human inactivity that makes hazards and turns natural hazards into disasters. While natural hazards are inevitable, the impact coming from disasters can be avoided. And that's where actually big data also plays a role. That's where I think I want to refer to all the contributions done by the panelists so far, where the use of big data helps us in preventing the damaging consequences coming from the hazards and preventing from hazards turning into disasters. The challenges, from a humanitarian perspective, they're very typical to the challenges also that we've outlined. One of the things is data interoperability, data availability, data accessibility. And what I mean here is, again, I would like to make a reference to previous meetings organized by ECLAC, positioning of the Caribbean in knowledge economy. While the Caribbean region is definitely not data poor, the problem is with data accessibility. And even with us, with the UN, or even in the humanitarian sphere, we collect so much data, we sit on so much data, and yet exchanging the data sometimes it's difficult. It's not only because we or other agencies don't want to share the data, and to that extent, of course, we and within the UN, we also have different MOUs and data sharing agreements and agreeing on the formats and how it's going to be exchanged. So it's not just about the lack of the will to share the data, but sometimes data is in different formats, might be on the same topic, but collected in different ways, in different interpretation. So it's also about data fragmentation, how we address data fragmentation. The other challenges, and it's not unique to humanitarians, but also typical for everyone, capacity and also funding. I will stop here.
Thank you, Regina. And then thank you for your intervention. Kishan, would you like to come here and then look at what are the still gaps remaining in big data for climate change and disaster risk or natural hazards, as Regina mentioned?
Yeah, and I think I want to draw on the previous comments about data availability and data accessibility. We have seen, for example, in the assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the science and the socioeconomics and the impacts and so on, that there still remains a paucity of data from small island states, which is a bit of an irony and a tragedy at the same time, because small island states are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, yet there's a paucity of data being able to be accessed in order to make the assessments that will inform the responses to climate change in these vulnerable countries. And in that respect, there's a critical part of information, not data, but information that is there, but needs to be harnessed in a way that can be used in big data analytics, and that's anecdotal data, anecdotal information, because we've seen, for example, time and time again, you talk to people, you talk to stakeholders, you talk to farmers, for example, they say, well, there was a time when this tree used to flower in February, it's now flowering in a different time. Or there was a time when this river was full with water, now it's just a trickle. And so you could get that kind of anecdotal data that manifests or suggests changes that are happening in real time, but cannot be scientifically supported. And therefore, one of the challenges that remain is how do you assess that kind of anecdotal data, and how do you put it in the context of big data analytics to make sense in the context of some of the
thank you,
natural
Kishan.
hazards.
I mean, you touched on something very, very important in terms of climate variability, and I think in your opening remarks you mentioned about forecasting as well related to big data. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Ramlal here in terms of predictive analytics, which is one of your areas of interest and also your experience. How has the big data helped in forecasting or building better models in relation to predicting natural hazards or climate variability?
The interesting thing is that in order to get robust predictive models, you need as much data as you can. And being able to mine whatever data that is available is very important to make sure that you get reliable predictions, you get reliable trend analysis in terms of determining where you can go with this. So there are a lot of tools that are available now, even open source tools, to be able to do a lot. And with the advent of a lot more satellites to do remote sensing, we can now leverage more and more of that kind of data to be able to support especially smaller jurisdictions that simply cannot afford to leverage or put resources towards doing those kinds of things. So a quick example would be the Latin America and Caribbean Space Agency that was recently formed and funded by the government of Mexico, decided that they were going to set up what is called an open data cube for remotely sensed data in the Caribbean region. That project has been given to the UE. I happen to be the project lead on that. And we are creating a remote sensing center to be able to do the kinds of analytical work that would be necessary to support Caribbean countries and this data would be available for free to anybody who wants it, so that what happens is the reliability will increase even more, given that there are experts who are willing to support that. And that's part of the challenge that we do have, that when it comes to very advanced type of analytical work, you need specialists. And you don't, go to, down the street and get a specialist. You can't. And therefore, you need, very particular kind of skill sets to do that. Why not use, resources at the university, especially the UE, because the UE is a regional institution?
Thank you, Dr. Ramlal. While the audience is thinking about the question, we'll be opening the floor soon, but I'll just go to Ruana Hines. In terms of the role of legislation in data is very important, but is there any good example of where big data has been harnessed and where there has been a public, private, and people partnership within the Caribbean or internationally that you can think of, or something that we can use as a good example?
I would say what comes to mind is the Caribbean Climate Change Center, the 5 Cs. They now have a program, the acronym is LEADER, where they are working at the regional level through different governments and agencies in order to collect data that will be key for modeling as well as for building resilience and planning and so. The work, I think, under that project has just begun, but we expect that it will make a major contribution to the policymaking landscape in the region, as internationally now, within the global climate process, we're discussing a global goal on adaptation. And a global goal on adaptation presupposes some measure of targets, presupposes indicators for measuring how states are doing on adaptation. It presupposes a certain level of national adaptation planning. And this data that's going to be coming from the program that's run by the 5 Cs should help regional governments in that process of planning different responses and understanding even what their options are in terms of responses at the adaptation level when it comes to climate change. I would say, though, that there's one key issue that I wanted to mention that hasn't come up as yet in terms of one of the areas that's key if we're thinking about a legislative and policy framework for governing this question of data. And the ethical issues came up, issues around consent. On the other side of that, there's also the issue of cybersecurity, which is key. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have many recent examples of cybersecurity breaches. And this, we expect that this is an area that will increasingly become relevant as we make advancements in open data sourcing, and as governments come to rely more and more on data for their day-to-day decision making.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Abdul and Regina. I think, Regina mentioned about the collection of data, as well as that Caribbean is not data poor, and Abdul mentioned about the ethical use of data in the previous the previous response. Just in terms of, do you think there is enough investment being put into the capacity to build big data from your perspective and from where you stand in the Caribbean? I'll start off with Regina first, and then Abdul.
Enough investment. Can there be enough? How do you measure enough? Definitely, we can say that the Caribbean region is not left behind in this area, but certainly not left behind for now. There should be definitely accelerated move towards more investment. And investment in different areas. When we talk about investment, it's yes, investment in your human capital development. We'll talk about human resources. Yes, investment in technologies, investment in the policy and legislative framework, but also investment in corporations and partnerships. I think somewhere we heard that there was a lack or not sufficient partnerships go on. Investment in partnerships, and particularly I would like to highlight including private-public partnerships, because a lot of solutions, and I'm sure when we had a break, really I took a look at what we have on the display around just behind this conference room. The solutions are there, and when you talk to the private sector, you understand what resources are available there, yet there is a disconnect or divide between what is available there and what is actually used and taken by the public sector. So that's where also investment should happen.
Thank you. I think you raised something very important, the availability as well as the use of data. So Abdul, would you like to continue from there?
Yes. Thanks, Regina. I would like to dial it a little back. Before we even get to the investment issue, we need to talk about the awareness. You know, the awareness, the acceptance, and the understanding of the value of data. Because we were having a discussion on big data. We were having a discussion in the office on, regarding the seminar that we just had 2 weeks ago. And a colleague just made a side comment to me that we're talking about big data. What have we done about small data? You know, so we need to have that awareness and to raise the value of statistical literacy and to raise the awareness about the value of data. And then the investment will come naturally. For example, you made reference to the private sector, where the private sector understands the value of data, how they can derive benefit from it. The public sector may be not quite there yet, but once that awareness is raised and that there is, then the investment will come naturally. Professor Ramlan is on the CARIGO, which is an initiative, a UN private sector, public sector, academic institution initiative to drive the value of geospatial data and technology. But what you find is in this discussion at the initial stages, the government representatives are not as active. And when they do, they make it known that, you know, I'm just a technician. I don't have the power to drive things. But if the upper ups, you know, the PSCs and the ministers are well aware of the value of data, big data, artificial intelligence, then the investment will come naturally. So I don't think we do have enough investment yet, and we may not even get there in the near future. But I think we're getting there where, you know, the value of data is being raised. But one of the main obstacles is even the lack of data. You know, the small data is not there, and the big data, we don't quite understand what they are yet and how we can leverage the opportunities that do lie in big data.
Thank you, Abdul. And before I move to Kishan, which is the last question, and while you're thinking for your question, Kishan, I mean, Abdul mentioned something about government participation in the whole data space and the private and public. Just in terms of when you walk in the space of natural hazards, you see that there needs to be a partnership between government, private sector, the community outreach. What do you think is the role of the government in terms of education for the public as well as the utilization of data for the communities? Like what role government can play in that?
Yeah, well, certainly government should act as facilitator, one, across the board, but it also has a duty for public education and public awareness on various issues that affects the citizenry. And we have seen a lot of that happening actually in recent times where countries are now becoming more aware, and this is particularly for the region, they're becoming more aware of the need for individual responsibility, for taking individual responsibility to assist policy implementation, because governments cannot implement policy on a holistic basis. It takes that public-private kind of partnership, but also has a requirement for a healthy dose of individual responsibility, whether those individuals find themselves in sectoral employment, such as farmers, for example, or even the average consumer who burns electricity or who makes choices in what he consumes and what he purchases. So the more educated and more environmentally savvy, if I could use that word, consumer or citizen, is a critical partner for governments in implementing its policy agenda going forward. So critically, education from a government perspective is critical, but is also required for partnerships with tertiary institutions to develop that kind of needs for jobs, for green jobs, as the economy will evolve to eventually. So supplying the labor force in both the formal sector as well as the informal sector to satisfy some of those requirements. is also critically important to advancing the policy agenda.
Thank you, Kishan. I think one thing that you mentioned is about the policy implementation and the whole policy space where there is enough room for everybody. And also at the end, it depends on consumer choices. Now, I'll take about 2 to 3 questions, and our colleagues are roaming around with the mic. If you have your questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself for the information of the panel. And please keep your questions short. So we'll take 3 questions at a time.
Hi,
Yes.
good morning. My name is Audine Serju. I represent the Cropper Foundation. I also happen to be a member of the media. I am very heartened to hear Kishan's statements about public education and a lot of the references to the need for public-private partnerships. And I'm really keen to hear what our panelists think of the role of civil society in all of this. I know a number of you are obviously engaged with civil society, various NGOs, community organizations, but I think that's another key stakeholder in this process, especially when we talk about public engagement, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in relation to big data.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yes, I do have one, and actually it's in line with the question that was just asked. Our education system does not lend itself to big data. It lends itself more towards silos. I own this data, and that has crossed into government ministries, businesses, etc. We have a culture here that is not conducive to bringing all of the data together, when in fact all data is actually connected and it is needed by these models in order to make the kind of predictions. So my question to the panel, and I'd really like to hear some comments on our education system and what changes can be made at the level of kindergarten coming up to change a culture, not just based on the government. There must be some sort of public-private partnership, I think, because our government is itself a product of that education system. So private enterprise, multinational agencies, etc., I believe should come into play in our education system. It may be too late for us, but 30 years down the road, if we start now, we may have a population that is sensitive to these issues. So I would like to hear the panel on these. Thank you.
Before you sit down, can you just identify your affiliation, please?
My affiliation is with the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, statistics. Thanks.
Yes, Anand.
Good morning, everyone. Joel Ali from the International Organization for Migration. And I have a 2-part question. One, how can big data be leveraged for the average citizen? And also, how can big data be used to analyze things such as migration and mobility patterns? Thank you.
Okay, we have a good list of questions, starting from the first question from the Cropper Foundation, looking at what is the role of civil society that you think, and I think it's really linked to the question from the central bank, looking at the partnerships, public-private partnerships in data. We have a lot of PPPs in projects, but then moving from that to early childhood education as well as coming all the way up to tertiary education. So maybe I'll start off with Dr. Ramlal, and then we can share the responses.
You know, in the Caribbean region, we do have quite a few NGOs, and some more successful than others. And my own interaction with NGOs, I did a participatory project in Tobago, for example, first of its kind with respect to use of 3D modeling. And I worked with Canary, and I worked with other people in Tobago. And that project was very successful because of the type of experience and expertise brought in by the NGO to support the work that we were doing, and the awareness that was built, the kind of value that was brought to that project is very significant. So I see an extremely important role for NGOs, because the people on the ground who are able to bring together a lot of the traditional knowledge, the indigenous knowledge that may be required to add value to a lot of the things that we're doing. You know, it's not enough, I think, to use the satellites and use the the big data, if you like, if you integrate the small data, the nuanced data that would be required to support decision making, I think we do a lot better. We can really improve the way we do things. The other thing I will add with respect to the other question is that we must remember the digital divide. Not everyone is a digital native. We do have digital immigrants. We do have techno-peasants, I hate to use the word, but we do have people who are not able at this stage. But of course, cultural change or culture change is not a revolution, it's an evolution. It takes time, it takes effort, and therefore, in order for us to achieve the things we want to achieve, unfortunately, it will take time. But that means that there must be commitment from the highest level of government, and therefore the policies and the direction in which we go should not change every 5 years when we change an administration. We need to have consistency and a focus moving it ahead. And sometimes NGOs and other type of organizations like those, international organizations, can hold the policy and the direction steady so that what happens is we can achieve what we need to achieve in a longer period of time rather than only think about turnaround every 5 years or whatever the period is for elections.
Thank you, Dr. Ramal. I would like to bring in Kishan here, and then we can move from Gina to Ruana and then Abdul. If you can respond to,
Right.
And thank you for touching on the last question as well, on average citizens' role in data as well as migration.
Yep.
So,
But maybe I can take a stab at all three
yeah,
as well.
Go ahead.
Just in the interest of time. The question on the role of civil society, but just not to repeat what Dr. Ramal said, there are several NGOs and community-based organizations that are involved in active data collection and involved in activities that are contributing to implementation of government policy, for example. Partnerships with NGOs is critically important if they are to be engaged, not only for providing information and data, but also for disseminating within their own communities that kind of awareness and that kind of sensitization. And it comes back to the point I made earlier about individual responsibility and community responsibility. Because it's only when you have that sort of harmonious continuum from top to bottom that you could actually have the cohesive whole holding together. On the siloed approach, I totally agree. It's one of my pet peeves. And it's one of the challenges that we have had when we formulate policy, for example. Trying to get information from even different ministries has proven to be, less or more painful than pulling teeth. It's not like pulling teeth, it's more painful. When you request information, you request data to inform all of government policy, and they say, well, in some instances, I was told that I have to buy the data that was paid by taxpayers to be collected and resides in a government agency. I was told that you have to purchase the data, which was quite bizarre. So on the siloed approach, certainly that needs to be resolved. On the data for reaching the average citizen, actually that is already being done. It all depends on the application. When you use an app on your phone, it's really how big data is now condensed at the touch of a fingertip that can give you information for your own benefit. And we've been starting to look at how adaptation in the agricultural sectors, for example, can be used not only for farmers who deal with crops, but also for farmers who look at livestock, for example, if you look at subsectors. So we have been involved with farmers as an NGO, as a civil society group, to give them the information, the sensitization, and the application so that they can now, with the touch of a fingertip on their phone, everyone has a smartphone, can then assess what the weather patterns are going to be, what the drought periods are going to be, where flooding is likely to take place, what precautions they need to take, and so on. So that is one simple way and one effective way in which big data can now be down to the benefit of the average citizen.
Thank you, Kishan. I think I have to, cut short. We are out of time, but Last thoughts from Regina, Rowana, and Abdul on the 3 questions. Just half a minute into intervention, please.
Okay, quickly, first of all, to echo, the role of NGOs, community-based organizations, is indeed critical. You are the eyes and ears for the communities on the ground. That's what we usually get information for very quick action. Second, your education has to be continuous. It's not only like kindergarten, school, university. It has to be continuous. And where we do see, I think it will develop, where the population and the people, they see the benefits of it. And it kind of connects also when IOM asked about what the citizens, the role in this big data. It's all about where the benefit also comes specifically to citizens or for migrants. And I think I give you a specific example. When WFP started to involve governments with so-called CLS, Sedima Logistics System, where all different participating states within Sedima has to share information in order to generate so-called virtual warehouse in order to enable quick response. Participating states were a bit cautious in sharing this data. Only when disaster actually strikes and they see how it works and what actually benefits it gives to them, only then they participate. So only by encouraging and seeing that, yes, you can trust this action, yes, it brings you benefits, you will get the new engagement. And just my last point, again, more on migration. It will specifically, big data specifically also helps with modeling behavioral patterns. Again, specific example, when WFP worked with Global Pulse with refugees in Bangladesh in order to decide whether to use masks or to use isolation, we actually modeled how people will behave, given their behavioral patterns that we collected through the big data, what decision or what measure would be more effective. So yes, it can also play in role in migration.
Thank you, Regina. And for information, I mean, WFP has also released a report on food insecurity. If you have time, you can read that. I'll go to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to attempt to answer all 3 questions with one observation. From a lived experience, I had the privilege to be in the Marshall Islands in March of this year and to witness a community consultation that they were having to discuss adaptation and loss and damage issues. For context, the Marshall Islands is an atoll nation. It means that they are tiny, tiny coral islands with almost no elevation above sea level rise in the middle of the Pacific, arranged around a lagoon. So any amount of sea level rise means that islands are literally disappearing and have already begun to disappear. And I had the opportunity to sit in on a community-based consultation on adaptation and loss and damage measures, where the discussion was about, in the first instance, sharing information about what the modeling is saying around the impacts that the Marshall Islands is expected to experience, but also consulting the communities about the range of options that exist in terms of actual responses. Because at this point, they have to make difficult decisions around which islands to save. They have to make difficult decisions around where they can invest to get this very expensive modeling equipment to focus on which islands, to design solutions for which islands. And so just to make the point, I think a common thread in all of this is when we talk about data and when we talk about people, it's not always an extractive exercise. It has to go both ways. So I'll probably end there. Thank you.
Thank you. And you mentioned Marshall Islands. I've worked there. So the highest point on the island is 5 meters above sea level. So one tidal wave can wipe most of the islands. And that brings me to Abdul on the last panel. The last panelist on this.
Thank you. Civil society, you have a big role to play, especially so in big data, because it's those who produce big data, at least in our context, are generally the ordinary citizen, from their use of smartphones and other devices. So, and civil society is the closest to these persons. So you do have a big role, and there is, similar to what Professor Ramla mentioned about indigenous knowledge, there's a citizen science, which is gaining more recognition and relevance when we talk about sustainable development. And in that light, we've been discussing the issue of citizen-generated data with the national statistical offices, and now they can better engage the civil society in the use of citizen-generated data. So you do have a big role, and you will be called to the table when things are being discussed with respect to the use of big data. To my colleague from IOM, big data is actually already being used in the region, in mobility. For example, following the volcanic eruption in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there is a humanitarian aid organization called Direct Relief. And they were able to use mobility data from the Data for Good project of Facebook, Meta, and they were able to locate how citizens were moving from one location to another. And that's, I suspect you are more interested in international mobility. So if you can use it for internally displaced persons, you can use it for international migration. The issue then is the trust. If somebody is moving internationally, because they will have to be the one generating this data and making it available for analysis, will they think that the data they are producing is going to be used for law enforcement, or it's going to be used for services to help them through their migration? That's the issue that we have to now resolve and build that trust.
Thank you, and I think we should thank our panelists in the usual way for sharing their experience and insight. Thank you.
So I wanted to echo Raymond's thanks to this panel. It started off, I was expecting a policy discussion, and it turned into cultural discussion. And I think it's building nicely. We started off about, sort of like the big picture view, and now we are seeing like the cultural change that has to happen with relation to these things. And the next session we're coming to deals with the technology that's required to be in place to have this happen. That said, lunch is available, right? That session is a working lunch. So you're expected to bring your lunch back into here for the following session, which starts in about 20 minutes. I will give you 20 minutes to go get your lunch and bring it back in here. The next session that starts, which is also about the transformational role, is a working lunch. All right? So please, to be respectful to the next set of speakers and moderators, if you can go get your lunch now as quickly as possible and bring it back into the room. Thank you very much.